How
Nice
are
to see
you?
you again. A bit nervous, but okay, confident.
Good, good.
It's the public that gets me nervous.
Oh, you think? Oh, well, I don't know. I don't think about it at all. I'm just having a one-on-one conversation. That's the best way to look at it.
Okay, so how have you been doing?
Not too bad. Not too bad.
That's good.
Have you had a chance to see the Philip Chase AP Kahneman conversation?
No, not yet. I
Not
haven't
yet.
the
Okay.
time to do pretty much anything lately.
No, no.
There are at
You're
least
busy.
10 things you posted that I meant to see and I didn't get to, so I have a bit.
Oh, right.
Okay, so let's get started.
Okay.
Uh, this one it will take a while for me to work my way into this first question, so please bear with me.
Mm-hmm.
Going to go back to the possession scene.
Oh, okay.
From my point of view, that's a gorgeous scene and it's underrated, and there's so much information other than a god possessing a little girl.
Mm-hmm.
First, we have Riga and her her hatred for the empire and her recollections of a time when they used to be free. Maybe life
Yes.
wasn't better, but at least they were free.
Yeah.
And there's this resentment that she feels. And like a mirror, we have this young girl who has no idea how life outside the empire feels like, and the conflict between the two of them.
Mm-hmm.
Then we hear Riga's story, how she lost three husbands and two sons to the Empress's wars, and not just the resentment against the empire, but against Lassine herself, as she's the
Mm-hmm.
one leading it and making the demands. And also, like in a mirror, we see the fisher girl so fascinated with the horses and the soldiers passing by and the armor and all the glamour, and she looks at them as if they are heroes. And then we see Riga snapping and attacking the girl, which is understandable from her point of view, but a bit of a shock in its aggression, or just
Mm-hmm.
grabbing her by the hair and getting so angry about it. And then here comes this hero saving the girl from being attacked.
Mm-hmm.
And the aftermath of that, she's lying dead on the ground in the dust. And it makes me wonder if Lassine is even aware of the existence of people like Vriga, and maybe if she's aware of the abuses that her soldiers commit, because that was a murder that went unpunished.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was probably not intended as a murder. Um, I think he strikes her with a gauntleted hand as he rides past, and sometimes just those random acts of well, interference in something, protecting this young girl who's being, uh, from the looks of it, being assaulted by this older woman. Um, so, as far as that soldier's concerned, he did a good deed, not knowing that he actually killed the older woman. So basically, it's a scene. It's setting up a lot of things. It's setting up the idea of the way the pageantry of the sort of the visual pageantry of the military plays a role in a society, um, and how it inspires the young and makes more cynical and angry the old. So there's a generational difference going on in terms of what's being seen. Um, and then so Riga's sort of emotional response is just I should say she snapped. The anger was sufficient that the romanticism that she saw, shining in the eyes of the young girl, was just, a step too far, as it were. Um, and so they're all in terms of Lassine being aware of what the soldiers do. Well, no, these are random acts. They happen all over the place. and they're part and parcel with a militarized empire. So um, that kind of sets the two at odds with each other, and I wanted that sense of Riga being quite ambivalent, and her belief systems are all about sort of this notion of freedom. Um, what that represents is long been skewed by her grief for having lost various loved ones, um, so that she would not be, somebody who would immediately jump into the lap of the possessing god, that she would stay apart and stay separate. And then by doing so, she would be able to preserve something of the girl. That was kind of what was being set up.
Another detail from the conceptual one, the realization of what she was doing with those tallow candles.
Mm-hmm.
Despite her poverty, she was saving every penny to make these candles and talk to her gone loved ones.
Yeah.
And funny, maybe in a way that reminds me of all of this technological communication. You're talking to a person who is there but isn't there, kind of like she's talking to her dead loved ones in a way.
Yeah.
But the one detail that I loved the most about that scene is one that I later saw criticized in a comment. It was the spitting.
Mm-hmm.
I spits the first time, and I'm thinking that's an odd thing to do, but maybe it's a cultural thing, despise, anger, something like that. Then she spits the second time, and I'm thinking that's weird. Why two times? Maybe it's just her habit. The third time, I'm thinking there's something about it. There has to be something about it. And then after the possession, the first thing Sorry does is spit. And that was when I knew that Riga wasn't gone.
Yeah.
Now, I had seen this comment at some point long time ago. Somebody was saying that there's some sort of classical fantasy rule of three where you repeat the same thing three times in order to make it obvious, and that you had abused this rule in your writing. And he gave this specific scene as an example. And I'm thinking, I don't know how the rule works for fantasy in general, but in this particular scene, it was used flawlessly and it made sense and it had such an impact. So,
I'm not aware of any particular rule like that. Sometimes people just make up weird things. um, no, the spitting was very much a subtextual signpost for, um, so for Riga, it's a gesture of disgust um, regarding the empire. Um, but it serves a secondary purpose in that when Sari is possessed, we see that trait repeated almost immediately to hopefully cue the reader that, as what happened with you, the Sirius is not gone. She's now sort of buried deep in Sari. So that's basically the reason why that little gesture is occurring in the scene. Now, I'm not aware of that there being tropes like that. That sounds very strange.
I
I thought I knew most of the tropes.
I heard this. I saw this comment a long time ago, soon after
Mm,
I joined the Malazan Empire. That's almost 3 years now. So
mm.
I don't remember who said it or what was the context, but that person seemed really irritated by it, and it made no sense to me. Another little question about this scene is, why did Riga end up possessing Sori? Was it an accident or was it an act of will on her part? Or was it
um,
a
I
connected
wanted to be relatively unanswered in the sense that we don't even know that the blow to the head actually killed Rigalai. She just took the opportunity, sensing something was coming for Sari. She had to leave her body permanently in order to do something about it. So it's kind of her gesture of saving the one child she never had because she lost her other ones. Um, and I wanted to leave that ambivalent so that one can't be quite sure. So it's one of those cases where stylistically the writer pulls back and just records what's, you know, sort of what's seen, as it were, um, and leave the interpretation as open to the reader as possible.
Okay. Um, at some point, Taishan asked Tercel for a deck reading, and during
Mm-hmm.
this deck reading, she identifies Sori as being the Virgin of Death. Now, given that Sori is actually an ascendant herself, she's the rogue. That brings the question, can an ascendant of a house play a role in another? And does it mean there was already an alliance between the two houses, Shadow and Death? And also, did she keep her place as Virgin of Death until Sin took over the position? Because if Absalar remained Virgin of Death, of High House Death, even after her possession ended, then that points to a very strong connection between the two houses, and having a servant of Shadow occupy a role in High House Death is a pretty big deal.
Yeah. To answer your first question, yes, various roles can be taken on, and multiple roles can be taken. We wanted to keep the deck of dragons as fluid as possible, and we wanted to make the readings situational so that they related specifically to um, the environment surrounding and the circumstances surrounding the person doing the reading at that specific time, so that nothing is ever completely fixed, and roles can be assumed. And in many ways, actually, who is it saying? I think somebody recently had been doing a reread, and they read one of these readings in one of the books, and I think he made the point that you laid out the whole plot in that reading, and I said, yeah, of course I did, and I often do that. I lay out the plot in a reading, but it's obscure enough that, you know, especially if you're reading it for the first time, you just don't see that, right? But it's all there. Um, and it used to be kind of sort of my inside joke in the sense of um, laying things out in such a cryptic way that the first time through, um, you're only picking up pieces of it. And it's only the second or third time through that it becomes clear that the entire plot of the entire novel can be laid out in one reading. And that was just fun on my part. But yeah, various roles can be taken on. And the question of whether Shadow Throne and Hood were already preparing sort of their long range plans, I think needs to stay open. So I'm not going to answer specifically, but um, I think in a lot of ways there's so much foreshadowing going on in the novels, um, and that sort of the grand scheme that was leading up to primarily Toll the Hounds. Um, yeah, it's a long term plan that's at work. But the key thing to remember is readings are always context specific, so they do change around a fair bit, and the reader as well. And that's kind of where I get into the metafictional aspects of things, because the reader actually, or not even metafictional, well, it is, but it's also quantum. There's a kind of entanglement between the reader and reality through the deck, and so the reader actually can change the outcome. Um, and that sort of kept it as freewheeling as possible in terms of uh, specific roles played at any one time. I don't know if that answers you, but
Yes,
that's
it
my.
does. It's actually interesting. And I do remember going through the readings the first time and thinking, I have to remember the number of this page. And when I get further into the story, I have to come back because it will make sense.
Yeah.
So I did wonder if you were having fun with it. You already answered that.
Oh yeah, and especially when Fiddler does readings. Yeah, I have great times when Fiddler's doing readings.
Another thing that actually surprised me this time, For all intents and purposes, the identity of Amanas and Cotillion was revealed to us in Derao's Gates, when Sori suddenly has a memory of herself as dancer. But in Gardens of the Moon, Kalam puts together the fact that nobody heard of the two of the shadow gods until after Dancer and Kellanvet died, and that whatever disagreement there is between High House Shadow and the Empire seems to be personal. And then
Mm-hmm.
Tattersail even punctuates it for us, thinking, "Damn, is it so obvious?" And I'm thinking, was it what's so obvious to you, woman? I can't get it. So I
Yeah.
was wondering, how did you plan these details?
Um, you mean in the reveal? I thought I'd made it fairly, you know, right beneath the surface that what they're talking about, you know, should fall into place at some point for the reader. Um, but of course, then afterwards, I thought, well, maybe not quite enough. So, you know, I did a more direct reveal in Dead House Gates. Um, yeah, I mean, you know, the minute they showed up on the page in Gardens of the Moon, Amianis and Cotillion, uh, you know, I'm already aware of who they are. Um, Cam, I think, was at least planning to write Knight of Knives, and of course we had gamed it all, so you know we knew the outcome in that respect. Um, and so yeah, I thought I was being a bit more obvious in dropping hints, but I often create dialogue that circles around a subject, and the subject is invisible, it's unseen, and so the dialogue basically is like slapping clay on an invisible rock, and that gives a shape to the rock. Um, so that's one way for me to not be too obvious when I'm providing information, info dumps. It's there, it's just under the surface.
This one felt like a itch you can't quite scratch. You know it,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't get it.
Mm.
Oh, okay, next one. While Paran lies on the ground before Hood's gate, the two opponents explain how the trouble with the Ascendants is that they try to rig every game, and that they delight in certainty, and Opon's nature is somehow to balance things. And that sort of reminds me of the bigger theme that runs between in the area of the war between chaos and order imposing one on top of each other.
Mm-hmm.
Made me wonder if Opon, by acting in, in in this random way, is actually a tool of chaos in this whole game of order versus chaos. But on the other side, later on, an Amender claims that what Opon is really after is the nexus of power, the whirlwind where games get nasty, and that everybody wants to know if immortal blood is going to get spilled, which suggests an actual purpose to Opon's actions and not random chaotic activity. So
Mm-hmm.
how does that work? Is it a tool of chaos, or I mean, do they act randomly or do they have a purpose?
um, I think this is going to sound strange or even invasive, but I think it's a bit of both. um, I think for, well, put it this way, one is driven, these gods are driven to particular acts just like we are, and then after the fact they turn around and explain them that they planned it all along. um, and so it's basically taking credit for whatever the outcome happens to be. And so Opon is very much in keeping with that random aspect of things, and so it's part of their nature um, to make use of chaos and to affect change in some fashion or another, and that's what entertains them. And so as gods, they're really more interested in the entertainment aspects of things than anything else. And so by entering a game, it's very much a game for them, even though it's life and death for a lot of mortals. To them, they're almost indifferent to that because they've sort of as gods, they're less interested in um, the actual outcome of anything. They're more interested in just being there, playing, being in the game in some fashion or another. And it's their means of using mortals to mess up the plans of other gods as well. Um, I think a lot of sort of deep-seated cliches can exist in fantasy, especially with regard to chaos. Chaos is viewed as the enemy, and order is your friend, as it were. And I've always had a very ambivalent sense or belief or feeling regarding how those two are viewed, because I find order uh, taken to its extreme, of course, is basically fascism. Is basically um, oppression, and chaos is to me the spice of life. It's what it's those aspects of the unpredictable that actually make life worth living. So I wanted to really undermine the fantasy trope of chaos as the enemy. Um, but even there, I wasn't leading up to that until Toll the Hounds, until Rake Animander does what he does in collusion with Shadow Throne. And of course, the act that triggers everything that happens in Toll the Hounds between Rake and Dassam um, employs Dassam as the agent of chaos. And so the randomness of their of their battle is actually crucial to sort of the subtextual themes of what I was playing with. So yeah, I don't. It's like darkness is often viewed as frightening and evil in fantasy, and I don't buy that either. Um, there's a calm and a peace that exists in darkness, obviously, and that flows over into notions of death and the end of things. But I mean, the ultimate order is the dead object, the inanimate object is perfect order. So why on earth would one want that?
That's actually one of the aspects I enjoy the most, the one about darkness in particular. I'm quite dark friendly. I tend
Yeah,
to
dark friendly. Yeah,
like
yeah,
I'm a bit of a night owl, standing up till late. There's something about the silence and the peace and the darkness, actually.
yeah. You ever notice in it's a classic scene in films. It's either policemen or your heroes or whatever. They go into a dark place and they've got their flashlight, and of course, cinematically, it looks great because the flashlight flashes all over the place. And of course, what the flashlight does is it may illuminate what it's directed towards, but it makes everything else darker. And then, of course, the baddie is out there in the complete dark. And my response always is, if you're being hunted by somebody in the dark, turn off your flashlight because you just made yourself a beacon to this other person, and they can see you, and you won't be able to see them. So yeah, turn off the flashlight. Um, I remember one time on an island in Croduck Lake, we were camping, and a bear was on the island. It wasn't a big island, and so I could hear it outside, and there was moonlight, but there was no other light. And so when um, my wife was in the tent, so I was concerned to have the bear that close. So I got out of the tent to chase it off. And of course, without a flashlight, I could see the bear perfectly fine. If I'd had a flashlight and pointed it in the wrong direction, I never would have seen the bear at all. So yeah, I have no, I'm like you. I like darkness. Darkness can be safe, if you will, um, and it's a protective thing. And if in fantasy and stuff, if somebody's going to be moving around at night, yeah, don't carry a torch. It just strikes me as the opposite thing of what you want to do. So yeah, I'm with you on that.
And of course, your approach to light, particularly your approach to light in Fall of Light, it was gorgeous. But we'll get there eventually. um, Next one, Whiskeyjack reveals that Dasem accepted to be Hood's knight at Igatan, and then something went wrong and he swore an oath of vengeance against Hood. But we know from the other books that Dasem had accepted to be Hood's actually, well, not knight, but still his mortal sword long before that. So would this be a wrong recollection from Whiskeyjack's part, or how does it fit?
Yeah. I mean, characters don't know. I mean, Dassem always was Cam's character, and when he played him in the games, he played him very, very close to his chest. So he did not reveal too much in terms of motivations or feelings. And so Whiskeyjack has an apocryphal story about Dassem and the First Sword of Empire. But Cam and I actually gamed out that whole sequence of the Mortal Sword for Hood. And so we already had that. I had that story sort of sitting in the background. The actual details, which I knew I was going to touch on in Dead House Gates when they get to the Zath House Tremolor. But even there, it wasn't my story. So I was just going to leave them, leave those little tidbits lying around. And if Cam ever wanted to, write out that story of Dassem, then he was free to do so. And then everything that I wrote would just fit into place, into the puzzle of his storyline. So, yeah, unreliable narrators everywhere in this series, right?
But that's nice, actually. Makes you wonder what's what and who's.
Yeah, no different from this world, right? Four people can all witness the same thing, and they'll all tell you a different story, about what they witnessed.
So. This one is a little, I don't know, not such a big question. Opon, the Lord, he claims that the sword is a far more subtle tool than a coin, which makes me think, did they have two objects of power? Because we know the coin is Opon's, but
yeah, the spinning coin is thrown into the mix. But because Paran named his sword Chance, they were already in the game, as it were. So, which is, so for Opon, you've got the luck that pushes and the luck that pulls. So I needed both sides. And Paran survives, the assassination attempt primarily because of his sword. And then the coin is then thrown in. And so he becomes the focus for sort of both sides of Opon. And that's the thing with Opon as a duality. They create a tension between them, and it's that tension that is also part of their personal game, the game that the lady and the lord play endlessly with each other. So yeah, there needed to be two elements.
that was actually my next question about it, because the Lord's is the luck that is bad, and the lady has good luck, and the coin seems hers, obviously, because Crocus was protected all the way through. He had this insane luck the night he found it. But on the other side, except for the end, Paran also had good luck, even though his patron is the one that has bad luck, which made me wonder why. Was it because they needed to protect their tool?
Yeah, and also you have to think of who and what Paran is up against. And so, the larger the forces that he's facing, the more of an underdog he is, and yet the more useful he is to the gods, because the gods aren't really interested in the fate of Paran. They're more interested in how Paran can mess up the plans of other gods. So, yeah, they got to keep him in the game.
So they had to give up their own tendencies in order to keep him alive.
Also, I think doesn't Paran give up his sword at some point?
And Amanda tells him after he kills the hounds,
Yeah.
when his luck turns bad, he should get rid of the sword.
Mm,
I believe he snapped it, but I don't remember anymore.
yeah. Yeah, I don't either. Yeah.
Yeah, but I should. I just read the book. The opponents claim that the fact that Moranth was murdered by a god's hands makes him fair game in their negotiations with Hood. Is there some unwritten rule that if a mortal dies directly at the hand of a god, then Hood's claim on that soul can be contested? And that makes me think actually of Hood's claim on the souls within Dragnipur, because he doesn't have the power to claim them even if he wants to, and Amanda won't allow it, but technically there would be a territorial dispute, so to say, over
Oh,
those.
absolutely. Absolutely. No, Hood was always pretty much pissed off at the whole notion of Dragnifer. And if you recall in Fall of Light, because I'm rereading it right now for as I work on Walk in Shadow, and I just got to the scene where Caplo goes into Elemental Night and faces off with Draconis, and the building of what's in Dragnipur is right there, and Draconis is working on it. So there's always been, and Hood is present in Fall of Light as well. So they have a long history, and in terms of that kind of ownership of the soul, the souls of the fallen, yeah, absolutely. What Draconis did was break the rules and impose a separate realm. And so all of that needed to be resolved at some point or another. And so that's what everything leading up to Toll the Hounds is leading up to that resolution.
Yeah,
But yeah, the Hood was quite annoyed. Yeah.
but if the opponents are right, since all those souls died at the hand of a god, so direct intervention, then the ownership of those souls could be contested.
Sure, but they didn't die at the hand of a god. Rake's not a god. Adamander's not a god, and nor was Draconis. And well, the role Draconis was playing, he was removed from quite early on in the scene. So the weapon's been in Adamander's hand for a long time, and he's not a god. Um, so in that respect, it's the kind of argument that would go into long years of litigation in a court, right? As to who owns those souls.
Well, and that brings the question of the difference between ascendants and gods, because ascendants are basically gods, and Rake is an ascendant.
But he's not worshipped. That's the difference.
He does have worshippers, he just doesn't want them.
Mm. Yeah, it changes a little bit by the time we get to the god is not willing. The cult has become somewhat more formalized, um, which you can do once the subject of your worship is dead, basically. Um, so Rake was always a character that was going to reject any notions of worship. That was kind of central to his personality, I think, more than anything else. So yeah, he would never view himself as standing on equal ground, say with the gods, with Hood or Opon for that matter, or Fenner or any of the others. So.
That brings me now to the fate of the souls of the Andii. I would assume that before what happened in Carcanos and Mother Dark turning away, their souls would go to Eternal Dark, not to Hood's realm. But after she turned away, where do they go? I mean, there's a scene, all the same scene where the Opons negotiate with Varan, and in the shape of Hood's gate, no, his messenger keeps changing shape.
Mm-hmm.
One of those shapes is a desiccated Ticed Andii, which might suggest that they go to Hood's realm. So where do they go? I mean, we know about their rituals, that they leave their dead on the field, that they don't care, that they consider that once the soul has departed, the body has no value. But what
Hmm.
happens to their souls?
Um, I don't even know if I ever consciously answered that. I just wanted to sort of, I like the notion of if they have lost their goddess, then these souls will probably wander more than anything else. So they could wander into Hood's realm. They could hang around. They could do whatever, whatever struck their fancy. Um, so no, I never had really any specific location or locale for them. And I remember I played off that in Midnight Tides, I think, with the Tice de Dieu, trapped in these crystalline forms. Um,
Yeah, those are the souls of
yeah,
Christ Andii trapped in dragon blood.
yeah, yeah. And of course, the whole thing about draconian blood is that it is such a force of chaos that it alters anything it comes in contact with. And so, if somebody has absorbed that blood, they've taken on draconian traits, dragon traits, which changes the entire game completely for them. So they probably have a bit more freedom in terms of where their souls go. Conversely, they may have less control on where their souls go. It depends on the dragon the dragon blood and the specific dragon that they've absorbed. I'm probably giving lots of spoilers away for some aspects of Walking Shadow. But anyways,
Some
hopefully people forget.
some things were already hinted at.
Mm,
We know that certain souls, like people like high priests, mortal swords, shield anvils, when they die, they don't go to Hood's realm. Their souls go to their god's realm.
mm-hmm.
Like Itkovian, he was going to go to Fener's realm. What if uh, Drake was to kill one of them? Can Hood no, not Hood, Fener? Could he contest that? Can Drake claim a soul that already has a contract, so to say, waiting for it?
Sure, sure. That sword can steal anybody's soul, and who's going to argue? Fenner's not going to. He's going to be annoyed, but that's about it. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, even the gods don't want to risk a confrontation with that sword, so because they may end up chained to it.
well, that's a cool answer. Uh, the opponents said that they can take Paran back, but somebody close to him would have to die instead. And there has been a lot of speculation of who this person was. My personal gamble is that it was his father, the one that Tavor offered to represent the family during the culling.
Mm.
Was that what you mean, or you never really considered it?
Um, no, it's not the father. No, it's Felicin. It's his sister, and so it hasn't happened yet, but it's coming. So it's foreshadowing that somebody in his family is going to take his place, as it were. So I mean, there's a huge element in which both Paran and Tavor are responsible for Felicin's fate, and one of them is the obvious one in Deadhouse Gates, um, with the enslavement and sending to the Tataral camp. That's Tavor's side, but Paran has a side as well, and this is it, what you just described.
Um, Tattersail's next reading tells us without a doubt that Whiskeyjack is the Mason of High House Death, and that the Mason is the builder of barrows. And his showing up in the deck tells us of death not of few, but of many. And it is also a reminder of how many soldiers Whiskeyjack ordered to their deaths during his career. She sees menhirs standing behind him, covered in glyphs that remind her of Seven Cities language, but she can't recognize what I would guess it's First Empire writing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Menhirs are usually associated with time, past, present, and future. And she says that the Mason carved the script on them for himself. Is this mysterious reading the first foreshadowing of the fate awaiting the bridge burners and their future ascension as guardians of the dead?
Yeah, yeah, and Whiskey Jack's fate as well. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. There is a card I think that Cam had in the deck of dragons because he created it, called Dolmen, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that also relates to that kind of stuff as well. Passage of time.
Also, during this reading, she foresees her own death delivered by the Mason of High House Death. And more precisely, she says that the Mason is building a barrow and there is a lot of blood flowing and it always flows down. And this blood flowing down touches her. Does she mean that if she had chosen to walk away from the bridge burners and their mission, she might have survived? Is destiny avoidable in the Malazan world?
um, I have to give two answers on that. At the time of writing the Malazan Fallen, I would have argued, and probably did, subtextually throughout the series, that destiny is an avoidable thing. There is no such thing as fate, as it were. Um, all these years later, I look back on it, and my sense, at least of my own, my own life, is that um, everything sort of everything falls into place when it's supposed to. So in my sense, on a personal level, um, I really have no objection to the notion of fate anymore. But I suspect when I was writing the series, I probably did, as a product of resistance to the notion that that in any respect, my life is already, and my fates are already decided. I think when you're younger, you would rail against that, just out of nature. Uh, and the older I get, the less concerned I am regarding that one way or the other. So two answers. I think while I was writing it, yeah, I would certainly argue that fates were avoidable. But then the personalities of individuals will, it will guide them to a fate in some fashion or another. So in other words, somebody's inclinations, somebody's principles, somebody's integrity, um, could be said to be forces of fate, and that they drive a person to do what they do. Um, but of course, you can make that observation only after the fact. But because I'm sort of with Tattersail, I'm playing with notions of, the choices she makes are the ones that, on the basis of who she is, there were no choices. Uh, she just had to make these decisions, and so there was going to be an inevitable aspect to her fate, if that makes any sense.
Yes, it does. In the end, even knowing she still chose it. So
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And in many ways, I think, don't we all do that in some fashion or another? So
oh. Quick Ben, he's the big mystery.
who? Quick
Quick
Ben.
Ben, and this is the one instance that points clearly to him being a soul taken. He gets out of his warren, a warren that Teresiel doesn't recognize, and she notices a smell like that of spices.
Mm-hmm.
And the only other mention of it, I think, is in the Bone Hunters, where either Gessler or Stormy says the man might as well be a soul taken, but that's just word of mouth, no proof, no evidence. Now we know that one of the souls that he harbors is a Theist Andii. We don't know if he was soul taken, and we know that he can use the magic of the souls he keeps inside. But whether he is a soul taken or just using that magic, and even if he is a soul taken, we never saw him change shape. So what's going on there? Is it something you changed your mind about later, or
No, no, no. The origin of Soul Taken and Divers um, showed up quite early on. I can't remember if we gamed it. I know the Soul Taken side, I think we did game. I think it was basically our shape shifting idea. Um, So we had, sufficient draconian characters that soul taken, or I guess probably when we were gaming, we call it just shapeshifting. Because I think I'm pretty sure I invented the words for the novels, soul taken and divers. I have a vague memory of looking at sort of etymology, the word origins of diverse, and sort of twisting that around to come up with divers. And the reason why I did it was I was kind of tired of shape shifting as a trope, and I thought that it'd be nice if we could actually, shake that up a little bit. And then it occurred to me, well, wouldn't it be cool if you could shapeshift into multiple entities rather than just one? And I think my first thought was, a swarm of wasps or bees or something along those lines would be a pretty formidable martial and combat kind of option for a character in a role-playing game. Would be, switch into 12 wolves or whatever. And then you could play out all 12 wolves in a fight sequence, which was kind of cool. So, and then of course, once that was established, then one starts, the imagination starts working, and you start working out curious variations. And I don't know if this might be too spoilerish, but it did occur to me that one could be divers, i.e. shapeshifting into multiples. But why always just animals, insects, and other things? Why not people? And so that's kind of where, Quick Ben sort of fell into place in terms of his backstory. And that gives him that ability to make use of all the various warrens held by the various people that he absorbed while fleeing across Rariku in Seven Cities. But of course, he has a deeper backstory, which I can't really get into yet, but it will become a little bit more apparent in Walk in Shadow.
My bet is on Korea Delat, but we'll see. My bet is on Korea Delat. But we will see if I'm right. I know Cam has a human diverse in his books. It's Poe the Wizard.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it really was when I realized what it was. And that was one of my questions. That was going to be one of my questions, the origin of Soul Taken and Diverse, but you already explained. So one question less. The Moranth. We know that they are covered in chitinous armor, an armor that they never remove, but how about their faces? We know they have a visor, but how big is it? How much of their face does it actually cover? And how much of their eyes, nose, and mouth do we see? How do they eat with the armor on?
I think that's asked by one of the soldiers, isn't it? One of the squad members in one of the books is like, do they ever take these? Cam described the helmet as a Morion, or Morion. I don't know the pronunciation of it, but it's a full body. It's a full head helmet. So it covers the entire head and face. So yeah, always the question of, how do you eat with that thing on? Well, you can't. I mean, you've got to, unless they've got some kind of means by which they can turn all their food into, gelatinous paste or something along those lines. In the same way that some insects dissolve their food before they eat it. You just have to take the helmet off. And so that would make things like eating a ritualistic activity done in private, like just among the Moranth, as opposed to in the squads of humans and that kind of thing. So, I mean, the whole thing about the Moranth is they keep a lot of their culture very, very much behind high walls, and you don't get to see it. So,
from that point of view, they're just like the Segulai.
Funny that, yeah. Have you read Cam's books?
Yes, all of them.
Yeah.
There's nothing written in the Malazan universe that has escaped me, except
Right.
for your
Okay.
handwritten novel. I still didn't get to it.
Right. Right.
And the quarrel.
The quarrel.
The quarrels, the Moranth quarrels. Every art I've seen usually depicts them as either dragonflies or maybe bees, but now on this reread, I think I caught on the fact that they look most likely like
Like what?
mantises, praying mantis.
There's an element to them that's like a praying mantis, but not the wing side. It's um, quite dragonfly like. Uh, in other words, four wings in horizontal position, um, whereas a praying mantis, its wings fold down along the abdomen and then flick out like a locust. So a little bit different. But some aspects, I didn't want to, I wanted to sort of mix things up a little bit in terms of description. And I'm a huge fan of the praying mantis, anyways, um, as an insect, and I'm a massive fan of dragonflies. Having been on so many canoe trips and on digs and stuff, where the big versions that are in Canada, they're much bigger than a damselfly. In fact, they eat damselflies for breakfast. They're big dragonflies. And when you're on a canoe trip or something along those lines, quite often they'll be crossing a big lake and they want to rest, and so they land on you and they land on the canoe for a rest. And sometimes they land in order to eat. So they're quite often one will land. I remember one landing on my knee at one point, and it was eating an insect, and so I just kept paddling and watched it eat the insect. It was great fun. So I'm a huge fan of those two insects. Um, Dragonflies eat mosquitoes. That makes me, even more in my good books. Um, and the origin of the quarrel. This is crazy. This goes so far back. I was probably about 14 when I wanted to do a comic book in which I was going to use what then in the novels became the quarrel. So it was like another planet, and um, people were flying dragonflies around, big ones. Um, but this was a time long before anything digital, um, and so to actually draw out the comic frames was just taking me forever. It was just so slow, and so I kind of got dispirited at the notion of actually becoming a comic book writer and artist. But that was the actual origins of the quarrel. It goes right back to when I was like 14. Just like the Jagut, in terms visually, their origins are Edgar Rice Burroughs' Green Martians. Um, that's where they came from with the tusks and all the rest. And they came from the French painter who did the covers for the John Carter books by Ballantine, I guess it was, uh, in the early 70s, with fabulous, fabulous covers. So,
Nice detail. Uh, this is a complex one. How does Opon's intervention actually work? I mean, we have a few cases that are really obvious. When Paran hears a coin spinning after using chance on the hound on gear, and Relic Nom changes his plan to help Call and decides to kill Counselor Lim instead of Lady Simtal, and then he gets dizzy and he gets all of these amazing details just crossing through his head, and then he hears the coin spinning. And the same thing with Circle Breaker, who wants to get out of the spying business, but then at last minute he decides to tear the scroll, and he informs in which he was informing the eel about it, and after he's done, he hears the coin spinning. So these are obvious interventions, but there are so many instances where people had blind luck out of nowhere, and they're not that obvious, but there are way too many to be just casual. So I can't imagine Opon being omnipresent and waving their little wand everywhere. So how does their intervention actually work?
The way I view it, the spinning coin is, yes, I mean it's a clear signpost to the reader and to the characters that something unusual has occurred. But the mere presence of Opon in both forms, good luck and bad, then sort of triggers a whole sequence of random events. So in other words, their presence will carry with them a kind of pervasive blind luck both ways, good luck and bad. And that just sort of amplifies by them being present. And so it sort of gave me freedom to just have some fun with that and just have sort of, especially with Crocus, but other characters as well, just have a lot of fun having strange and unusual events occurring all around them. But of course, there's the dark side of it as well, where the pillar falls and breaks Whiskeyjack's leg and this kind of stuff. All of these things are sort of amplified by the presence. And I'm quite consistent with that because it becomes very, very clear when Hood shows up in Darujhistan in Toll the Hounds that there's a residual sort of atmospheric effect to the presence of a god.
So it's more like an action and then the ripples of those actions.
Yeah.
Okay. Krup, in Toll the Hounds, is the voice of the narrator, and he seems to be aware of everything that's happening in the city. Who is there? What is there? What's going on? In Gardens of the Moon, he says that the power of divination was in his head and he could not deny it. But divination is one thing and omnipresence is different. So he seems to me to have been around since before Darujhistan even existed, because when he tried to delay Rise, he pulls him into his dream in a time before the city even existed. Mm-hmm. Is he some kind of avatar of the city itself, despite being mortal?
Well, he would say so. I've often described Krup and Toll the Hounds as the cipher of the series. And this is where we're suddenly moving into metafictional, post-structural, postmodernist aspects of the entire story, of the Malazan story. So in that sense, Krup is both within the story, but also the narrator of the story. And by extension, also the inventor of the story. Because that is the nature of a storyteller, is the selection of details and the ordering of details in order to create a narrative out of something that does not implicitly have a narrative, which is us, our life. Our life does not have a narrative. We spend our time with an internal monologue creating a narrative. But more often than not, most of that's done after the fact. So it's always in the past tense. So we tell stories of what we've experienced. We tell stories of the lives we've led. And in that respect, Krup is my stand-in. He's my avatar. And when he appears, especially when he first appears in Gardens of the Moon, I am basically going all meta on that, because he has personified his flaws and his virtues when he walks out in his dream. And he basically tells you that, humility is the first one that gets hung on the tree, right? So it's the first one he dispenses with. And in a sense, that was an embodiment of the fact I knew I was taking huge chances with Gardens of the Moon, and I'd be taking huge risks with this entire series. And so in order to have that ambition, I had to dispense with humility. on my own part, in terms of just needing to have the conviction that what I was going to do was going to be worthwhile and was going to be in some way of value to readers. And the fact that I would have readers at all is a presumption that all writers have to sort of delude themselves into in order to sit down and put the first words on the screen or on the page. So Krup has always had this multiple purpose throughout the books, as my stand-in, but as the storyteller stand-in, as a narrator stand-in, and the inventor's stand-in. That's all implicit in storytelling, in creating a narrative out of a chaotic history. And so that's why he is both, he has to be omnipotent and omnipresent, because the story is, it's the narration itself structurally is delivered in tones of certitude, and that certitude is not only illusional, it's potentially delusional. So it's where the author has to live. And so I always wanted to be self-conscious of that, and remind myself of that. And Krup was my means by which I could do so, if that makes sense.
Perfect. And speaking of humility, going online, you see all sorts of comments. I've seen a lot of people complaining that Erikson is arrogant. While from my point of view, I was thinking, this man has so much capacity to defend himself in ways that will leave you hurt and broken, and yet he keeps quiet. I'm so much patience, so much humility, and still Erikson is arrogant. I don't see where that's coming from. You really have a lot of patience with criticism.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to sort of argue against somebody who just didn't like the books, or doesn't like my writing style, or was just not grabbed by it. I mean, you cannot reach everyone. And even if you produce something that reaches a lot of people, each person will be drawn to it for a different reason. And then, in their conversations and discussions among fans, they may find things they all agree with, but then they may find other things that they don't. And so interpretation and the things that appeal to people, you kind of throw everything at the wall and hope something sticks. But sometimes it doesn't. And so I'm not, I'm not going to sort of castigate anyone for not liking the books. I think the only thing that sort of gets my back up is when people sort of voice opinions regarding, well, actually proceeding on the assumption that I didn't know what I was doing. That kind of gets my back up, because I did know what I was doing. And in some ways, I remember this when I was first starting out as a writer. When I went to the University of Victoria and had my first workshops, I ran into this huge crisis. And I had a great instructor, a Canadian writer named Jack Hodgins, and he wasn't yet burned out. A lot of writing instructors, a lot of writers become burned out by teaching workshops, and it's maybe one of the reasons why I've really avoided heading into academia and getting into a program, because I've seen the effects on writers. So anyways, he was just fabulous. And because I basically, what I was discovering was I guess just by nature, just so driven and determined and relentless in my writing, that it was leaving me a complete, emotional wreck at the end of almost every story I wrote for the workshops. And I felt I was basically um, dismantling all my opinions, my worldview, everything, with each story I wrote, and it was just brutal. And you know, I was a person who wrote at night, and so sometimes I would write all night, and I'd be all grainy-eyed the next morning, having written something through. And so when I arrived there, I guess I arrived there with so much, you know, backlog, that I was kind of fevered as a writer, and just driven beyond belief. Um, and so I would talk with Jack about that, and he would basically say, well, you know, it's clear that nothing's going to stop you on this thing, so you just have to go with it, and you have to accept that the purpose for which you are writing is a personal one. It's got nothing to do with an audience. It's got to do with how are you going to work out, you know, the various buried traumas of your life, um, and then people are, you know, either going to sort of step on board with that, with some sense of sharing that experience, or they're just going to shut the door on it. And you know, those are the two choices you're going to be facing. And he did say at one point that, you know, the further you go into this, if you're going to write this way, the less it will be a job, and the more it will be a kind of a calling. And once that happens, your audience begins to diminish in size, because not everybody's out there for that. A lot of people are out there for flat out entertainment, and if you keep pushing, you know, the numbers get smaller and smaller. And of course, I was like 24, 25, so I didn't really have a sense of what that meant until much later, because it took me, you know, decades to actually get stuff published and all the rest. But I guess if I were to look back now on my publishing history, um, yeah, the audience has diminished, you know, with each book I write. You know, Forge of Darkness didn't sell nearly as well as Crippled God. Um, Fall of Light sold even less than Forge of Darkness. Uh, the Willful Child novels have very small audience. Rejoice, A Knife to the Heart, I had high hopes for, but just, you know, vanished without a trace. So I am, in a sense, I think the more I write, the smaller my audience gets. And so I guess Jack was right. You know, all those years ago, he saw what was coming. Um, and I guess sometimes so I rail against that, or I feel like I feel despondent about it. And so in terms of patience, I guess at certain points, yeah, one just gets poked, you know, once too often. But at the same time, you know, I think there's a lot of validity to uh, announcing you don't like a work. You know, you don't like a writer, you don't like whatever. That's that's perfectly legit. But the technical side of things, because of that drive that started way back when, Jack set me on the trail of authors like John Gardner, who talk about moral fiction, and and then I had another instructor called Bill Valgertson, who taught me about narrative structure. And so I know that stuff backwards and forwards, because I was devouring it. Um, and so in that respect, on the craft elements, on the structural elements, I'm prepared to defend myself and my choices. Um, and yeah, occasionally I decide to do so in a public fashion. Um, and you know, sometimes it seems I pay the price for it. You know, I have the temerity to actually speak up. Heaven forbid that an author should do that.
Well, I feel like you should speak up more often, but then I'm not the
Yeah.
one paying the consequences. So.
No, there is that. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, the next one is an easy one. What is the color of the fires of Daruchistan? because in Tall the Hounds they are described as sapphire blue, while in Garden of the Moons they are blue and green.
That's about right.
Okay, so both.
Yeah.
Another easy one. The scene where Crocus enters Chalice's bedroom, you describe his tools of trade in quite the detail, and I couldn't help asking myself, how would you know that? The tools that a thief uses.
I don't know. I just made them up. I figured, I can't remember what those tools were, so I must have just made them up on the fly, and they seemed useful. I suspect I know Cam and I both played thieves in the role-playing games quite often, so we were into that kind of detail. You needed the details, to actually create some verisimilitude to the character, and so things like wax and all that kind of stuff, yeah, it just showed up in the games, and I guess it transferred over.
Cool. Speaking of details and characters, the night that Crocus finds the coin, we briefly meet an assassin by the name of Tello Crafar, who gets killed by the Andii. Is he the brother of Seba Crafar, the man who would become master of the guild after Relic and Borkin disappear?
He's related. I don't think I decided whether he was a brother or not, but he's certainly related. Yeah.
And in a similar fashion, a one-time insignificant apparition, Krut of Taliant, has a jewelry shop as a front for the assassins of the guild. And he reappears in Tall the Hounds as the man who set the basis of the cult worshipping Relic Nom. How do you keep track of these details? Because these characters are so insignificant. How do you even remember their names and to pull them from the fog of history?
Well, that's usually a case of since I've got a massive, list of characters, if I can reuse characters, I will, because that just keeps the list, the numbers are high enough as it is, rather than inventing somebody on the fly just to play that small role. I'd rather sort of reuse somebody. Cam and I had a joke regarding the guy who was originally, I think, the recruiting officer in Gardens of the Moon, the one who gets the headaches all the time. And that we actually had a joke where he was going to show up absolutely everywhere behind the scenes. So slowly rising through the ranks, and the only cue or clue we would give to the reader would be him basically massaging his temples anytime a mage was near, sort of like this. I don't know if we stayed consistent with it, but I know for years we made sure. And I think his name became Aragon or something along those lines. And he would reappear in both our books. And that was just one of our inside jokes.
This one actually is not a very important detail, but I resonated with it. It's the scene where we first meet Circle Breaker. You describe the way he really knows the place. 6 years worth of night watch at this gate had bred a close relationship between the man and the rough cut basalt. He knew every crack, every chisel scar. He knew where the fittings had weakened, where time and the elements had squeezed the mortar from between the stones that gnawed it to dust. But this serves a lot of purposes. For one, it shows how old the gate is, and it gives background on Circle Breaker because it shows that he's been there a lot. But for me, it humanizes him in a intense way. We've all been there. We've all done a job staring at everything and knowing every little detail, but it's such an insignificant thing. Nobody would even think of putting it in a book. And yet it humanizes him so much. We can all relate to that, to being there, to having done such a job.
Yeah, and it also, it indicates that he's highly observant as well, right? That's sort of one of the main things, is that he's a man who notices details. So somebody can stand at a place and half an hour later have no memory of any details of that place. And he's the opposite. He, given the fact that he is a master spy, his ability to observe has to be sort of first and foremost in terms of his virtues and qualities. Um, but yeah, I think we've all been there. We've all sort of maybe not anymore. You know, you see everybody now when they're standing at a bus stop or you know whatever, they're just staring at their phones. So, you know, if you were to ask, you know, how old is that bus stop? You know, those panes of plexiglass. You know, I mean, how well are they fitting onto the frame of the bus stop? Um, are there cigarette burns on the old wood of the seat on the you know sitting in the rain shelter of the bus stop? These are things, you know, that's stuff I grew up with. You know, that's stuff I remember seeing and taking note of. Um, I remember I ended up giving Kataspala a trait in uh, Forge of Darkness. That's one of my own. And when I stopped becoming or being an illustrator, when I stopped drawing, because I used to draw constantly, but when I dropped the drawing and stuck with the narrative, I became sort of a writer, I guess. Um, these two fingers started drawing everywhere I go. People will see I'm literally drawing, and I'll draw outlines and used to drive my wife crazy. So what I do now is that it's gotten so reduced that it's just like it almost looks like a tremble or a twitch, but it's not. It's me drawing, and so I'm constantly. I will never. I mean, generational, I guess, is part of it, but I'll never be a person who walks around staring at my phone because I'm too busy drawing. You know, I'll walk around and I see details and I just draw the lines. Um, so, and then you know, Cam and I worked on a dig called Mud Portage that had rock art on a panel of stone, of rock that led into the water. And we worked, well, he did 3 full seasons. I did 2.5 seasons there. And you become intimately familiar with that panel of rock because every break you're out there sitting on the rock in the sun. Every time you go swimming, you're on that rock. And so you see how the light plays across it. You see how this is not rock paintings. This was pecked into the stone so that the images only become visible early morning and late afternoon. Uh, that's when the shadows, you know, raise the cupules and you can see the images. And so you just become so familiar with the passage of time and how light plays across the rock. And so all those kind of details, I think, are part of the obsession of an artist. You have to, and it may just be a proclivity, something that we already do. Um, but I sometimes wonder at this iPhone generation right now in terms of what are they observing of the actual world out here that becomes your source material in all your writing, because your source material can't just be other books. It's got to be the real world in order to be able to carry into your storyline that sense of the tactile, you know, the things that can be touched, the feel of stone or that bench, you know, at the bus stop, um, and the fact that I have a strong memory of a bus stop bench that was, you know, worn, actually smoothed. The wood was actually, you know, worn by just the sheer number of people that sat on it. Um, all of those details are the things that, you know, if you're going to write a fantasy novel, especially, that's what you steal from. You know, that's the part of the real world that you pull into the fantasy world to make it something that you can put your hands on and feel, not just see. So I don't know. I can't remember what your question was, but anyways, I could stop there.
Like, I recognize a lot of stuff. If it's about attention to detail, I'm not surprised that I related to him.
Yeah.
And I know what you're saying about the painting. You know, I studied music from my first grade to the very end in college, and I played piano. So every second I had, even during class, if we were studying mathematics or whatever, one hand writing, the other one was practicing doing my
Yeah,
finger movements. So
exactly.
I know what you're talking about. And no, I don't use a cell phone either. It's just make a call and that's it.
Yeah, yeah.
So I know what you're talking about.
Mm.
Okay, this next one might be interesting. We know that when Draconos accesses Coral Galen, there isn't only darkness, but there's also cold, a lot of cold. And when Baruch turns on a candle so he can see the maps, he realizes that Anomander reflects no more heat than inanimate objects. And that prompts the question, does Coral Galen affect the Andii only by turning their skin dark, or does the cold that seems to define their magical aspect also affect them? Would Anomander feel cold to the touch? And would it affect the other Andii as well? Because the book says that he doesn't reflect heat, not that he doesn't reflect light.
Um, I think that a lot of that relates more to the Elaine, relates to the draconian blood that's in not all Taistandi, but some. Um, so yes, there is an absence. If there's an absence of light, there has to be an absence of heat, and so chaos will have a role to play in that. But what I wanted to indicate with Rake was the sheer level of his self-control. In other words, he does not, what he emanates is subconscious. He's not aware of the emanation of his presence, but everything else is fully self-contained. Also, having their goddess, if you will, turned away from them sets a chill upon their soul as well. So there is nothing awaiting that soul after death. That's kind of the idea I was playing with, and so yes, he's going to feel cold. One of the things that I had to sit on for the entire series that Cam was able to actually explore was also Baruch's own background plays a huge role in all that, but of course that's not really revealed in any of my books. So yeah, just a detail.
Well, a detail. I have a feeling that a lot of women will have to incorporate this detail. Speaking of wrong information and characters who don't have the story right, Baruch recalls that he read a fragment of Gothos' Folly where Gothos mentions the Andii in an aura of fear and that he thanked the gods at the time that there were so few of them. And while being thankful that there aren't more of the fools who would ruin the world seems a very Gothos-like thing to do, referring to the Andii with fear since something Gothos, he wouldn't be afraid of them.
No.
So I would think that's a wrong source that Baruch has.
Yeah, and bear in mind both my minors were, well, one was history and one was classics. So, and we were certainly at the time there was a huge movement within the subject of history regarding social history, and a re-examination of primary sources. With renewed skepticism to what was being said. So a lot of what is sort of the reference materials that are cited and used throughout the Malazan books are all suspect. And so there will be multiple versions of fragments of Gothos Folly that are attributed to Gothos, but are not Gothos. And we wanted to, I think just subconsciously, both Cam and I wanted to make sure that stuff stayed slippery and very elusive. And it was also part of the joke of Gothos Folly being a suicide note that is unending. And people will definitely find that as an opportunity to plagiarize and insert their own belief systems into this fragmented, ongoing, eternal document. In the same fashion where, the Council of Nicaea stripped out huge elements of the Bible that didn't suit the moment. Things are subject to change. Things are subject to being edited, sometimes for all the wrong reasons. And so that stuff needs to sort of, it's all sitting behind all of the pseudo history that's being presented in the Malazan stuff. Is that it's all suspected, it's all dubious, and that needed to be part of everything. That the past has to stay slippery, it has to stay foggy, because the past is basically the tool by which people of the present make use of in order to justify whatever it is they do. And so that's the driving force. History and the past is to put it another way, is the fuel by which the present rationalizes its activities and actions and decisions and all the rest. And so that needed to be part of the Malazan sort of sensibilities, that we were going to be playing with those notions of history and revisions of history.
Okay, going back to Krup, I think the biggest feat of magic that people remember of him is withstanding Groot's hammer. But in Gardens of the Moon, there are many instances of him, at least him retelling stories of him using magic. There is one that actually caught my attention where he says that he stole the crown and scepter of a king from a sarcophagus lid, and he expressed his concern about there being too many priests in that tomb and the risk of awakening the king's wrath. And his mentioning of having faced wraiths before in the pits of Drak. And what caught my attention to it is, could this be a first foreshadowing to the fact that the tyrant of Darujhistan is still sleeping somewhere there? Could he have slipped in that tomb before?
Can you repeat the second half of that question? I didn't quite catch
Krup slip inside the tomb of the tyrant of Darujhistan, who we know is sleeping nearby?
You know what? Possibly. I don't remember. The thing with Krup is every time I moved into his voice, and bear in mind, I gamed him. He was one of my characters in Cam's Darujhistan campaign. And I played him as over the top as you can imagine. So even in the games, he was very irreverent. And so since he was playing a role of my avatar in the novels, there was going to be an element of irreverence to Krup in terms of everything built into the storyline itself. So I think I would answer by saying it's both true and a lie, but it's in Krup's nature to actually lie, because the entire story is one big lie, and the entire series is one big lie, et cetera, right? So I think when I moved into the voice of Krup and walk in his shoes, anything goes. And he will comment on the novel itself if he feels like it. And so there, in that sense, he has plumbed every tomb. He's plundered every tomb that could possibly exist in the Malazan world. And so I'm always skirting that edge of verisimilitude within the world and the fantasy that it is. And that's where Krup is on that edge. And I suspect that's probably why a lot of readers of the books can't stand Krup, because I think he just sometimes he says too much, I think. So it may be a case in that one, I don't remember it specifically, but where I just sort of, yeah, loosened the shackles a little bit and let him say something that he really should never have said.
Well, I love Krup and I like his word games. Sometimes when I'm stressed, I get a little dramatic and speak just like him, so I recognize him 100%.
Right. You refer to yourself in the third person, do you?
Not just that, the choice of words, the ir- irreverent reverence, and things like that. You know, the way
Yeah, he just mantles his own sentences. Yeah, yeah.
I tend to do that when I get a little stressed and I get a little dramatic and show off. It's known to happen. So, um, the Mahib's dream world in Memories of Ice, it
Mm,
actually turns out to be Telan or Telan, I don't know how you pronounce it.
Deland.
Before not only the vow, but also before the Imas began worshipping fire and Olarefil. So we know from later books that they used to worship nature and that the land was ruled over by the wolves of winter. And I was wondering, is Krup's dream world, a real warren as well, just like the Mahib's dream warren, which is actually the land, not a dream warren? Because he does say he's a victim of his own dreams. And I was wondering if it's just him complaining, or does it imply that the warren is real and when he dreams, he has no real control over it because it's a real place?
I think it implies both, but bear in mind everything I've just been describing about Krupp being my stand-in within the novel. Um, in that respect, his dreams are no different from reality as far as, in terms of Krupp's control over it. Um, that's probably not a very clear way of answering that. It's more a case of if everything is a creation of Krupp, then the dream world that he creates is also a creation of Krupp. But if everything that Krupp creates is simply the product of his imagination, then so is the dream world. So it's both, I guess is the only answer I can give you. It depends on how you read Krupp. If you're going to read him in a metafictional fashion, then his dream world is as real as his real world of Darujhistan and all the rest, because he's creating all of it. Um, if you read him as a character in the storyline, then yes, he is stepping into a created warren of some form or another, something a little bit outside of time. At least it runs on a different time scale. Um, that's why Krull is present there as well.
That brings me to the next thing. Krul, he sits by the fire and he feels no heat, and then he tells Krupp that he can feel the heat due to the fact that he lost all of his worshippers. So in a way, no worshippers, no sensation, you're alive, but you're not really alive. And then the very next observation that Krupp makes is that he himself can feel only little heat, which made me think of maybe he did have worshippers at some point. He still has a few, but not that many, so his sensation is limited.
He has one worshiper, that's himself. So
Oh, so that
he
answers it.
self worships. Yeah.
And then there's the issue of the fire that Krul is always warming himself by, that never emits any heat. And the aspect of time somehow related to that fire, because
Oh yeah.
we know of Hood's fire in Fall of Light, and its power was basically to wrap the entire army in a bubble of time. And Krup's dream world also seems to be somehow out of time. How does the fire play into this thing?
um, I don't think I want to explain too much about it, but um, a fire that burns and yet consumes no fuel is outside of time. Um, so it stands as a kind of a visual symbol of the state that Cruel is in. Um, And then, of course, we paralleled it with the crippled god, not dealing with fire, but with numbing smoke. So they're almost mirror images of each other. Cruel without his worshippers, and the crippled god who's lost his worshippers. And so, in a sense, the crippled god is numbing his pain on the ashes and smoke of a fire he can no longer see or sit before. Whereas Cruel has the fire, but has none of the benefits from the fire being worshipped. So those two are sort of sitting thematically opposite each other. And so Cruel, I mean, he's set up early in Gardens of the Moon, and we get some elements of seeing the crippled god in Memories of Ice, but we don't get back to that until later on in the series. But they are mirror images of each other, and so they needed visual tags of some form or another, and those two seem quite complementary, since we're dealing with forgotten gods or fallen gods. Is there a difference between the two? Well, that's, that remains to be answered, but that's probably why they were set up that way.
An easy enough one, not very important. Rennick Knobs says that he suspects Murillo might be an adept with a sword. But this is the one time we heard this concept, an adept with the sword.
Yeah.
Adept. We've heard of adepts in magical talent, like reading the deck, or the way Tattersall supposes that Fiddler is an adept in sensing magic. But how does it play with swordplay with fighting? He's not a mortal sword. He's not a first sword. He's
just good with it. He's good with the weapon.
In a magic sense?
No, it's it would be probably a Darujhistan based training school of some form. It's just not particularly explained. It's just thrown out there. And I think both Cam and I eventually in our books, especially, we steered away from the notion of inbred talents or something that you're born with. We wanted everything to be more merit-based and the product of hard work. And so I think that's probably one element that we abandoned in later books. So it's thrown out there. If anything, if you put too much weight on it, it's misdirecting. So I would advise people to ignore it.
Good answer. This one is almost like a play of back and forth. While Fiddler and his team are planting mines right in front of Baruch's house, he is watching the red ink spill over the map over the Darujhistan, and he sees that as an omen. And he runs to the window. He asks who's in charge of the construction crew, and right at that moment, Krup walks in, and he's distracted from it. He doesn't get an answer. While at the same time, the first thing Krup says is ask him how he should open the window, that it's hot. How's the quality of the air? At which he points that it's dusty. Everything's right there, but that doesn't happen. And Krup's question seems very opportune, as if he was suggesting he should look deeper into it. So it makes me wonder, did he know what the Malazans were doing there? Because, as I said, in All the Hounds, he was aware of everything.
Yeah, probably. But I think it's interesting. This Q&A session is actually all about Krup, isn't it? The whole session.
No, it's just a fragment.
No, it isn't, because everything I've been talking about in terms of the role Krup plays tells you that he's always going to be skirting on the edge of things. So the question of whether Krup knows about Whiskeyjack and the squad down the street below is always going to be left there. It's going to be left open to what the reader wants to decide. And quite often it will depend upon how you want to read Krup, right? Is Krup sort of standing outside the Malazan world? as my stand-in. In which case, of course, he knows about Whiskeyjack, because that was the previous scene, or the scene to come. Um, so in that sense, yeah, he's always going to be flirting with that notion of um, omniscience, and that's just me sort of just amusing myself as I'm writing, in terms of how much does Krup know? Well, I'm not going to tell you, because even I don't know. So
Well, the other option would be direct intervention from Opon. So
yeah.
I was wondering if he knew or if it was just chance.
um yeah, again, read it either way. It depends on how you read Krup.
Um, a small question. Hairlock, during a conversation with Quickben, he starts to think aloud, and he says that Gear should have killed Terrasail if Paran hadn't interfered. So was he that crazy as to allow himself to be tracked by Gear only to lead him to Terrasail? Because that's insane.
Yeah, no, he's rationalizing after the fact. Yeah, no, he was definitely on the run, and he fled to the most familiar place, as one does.
Um, Tool explains to Adjunct Lorne that the worms of the Imas are similar to those of the Jaghut and the Forculasail, blood and earth bound. So I was wondering what does that mean, blood and earth bound? And why Warrens? Is it a reference to both the Telan Warrens, like the one of the wolves and the one post the ritual with the dust and the flame?
I have to know a lot more of the context to answer that, and nothing's sort of been triggered in my mind in terms of your description, so I'm not sure. Um, I think probably, if anything, its primary function would be to just indicate how old they all are, and these are the elder races, which is, I guess, just the purpose is to separate out the elders from the present.
There's a mentioning about Paran's weapon chance, that it's important somehow that its first taste of blood was that of a hound. So I was wondering if there's a symbolism in the drawing of first blood, or how does it tie? Why is it important that the first person it wounded was a hound of shadow?
Well, in the sense that it did damage to a supernatural being. Um, uh, there's a lot of, I don't know if have you read have you read Norse mythology at all?
I know some of it, yes.
Yeah. Well, a lot of sort of attributions given to specific weapons relate to who those weapons, drew blood from. And so I think all that is just pulling in that kind of aspect of that even an inanimate object will have a history attached to it, which is sort of it's kind of the thing that sits underneath uh, what makes and turns people into archaeologists, because you hold an artifact in your hand, and nowadays, of course, you can do analysis and actually find blood traces or other organic compounds actually still on the blades, and so you can determine what they were used for, or when they were last used. Um, but as early on as an archaeologist, before we had that analysis and capability, it was just left to the imagination. You're holding a spear point in your hand, and you're just left wondering, what's the history to this object? How many hands has that rested in? And I guess it's a natural thing for, if I'm going to be writing a fantasy novel, that I'm going to pull that across. into the fantasy world in some fashion or another. To take that metaphorical aspect of that sense of wonder an archaeologist has holding on to something, an artifact, and just make it more palpable in the fantasy setting. So the sword has a history, and it acquires power via its history. And so if it draws blood from a powerful ascendant being, um, then that adds to its history. I've always liked the way a lot of the Norse myths uh, personified swords. I always thought that was very cool. So I guess it just made its way in there.
Nice. Back to the politics of the empire. The culling of the nobility is an established method, imperial method, yet in Pale, Lassine decided to have 9 out of 10 nobles killed, including children. So I was wondering why the extra cruelty? What was she trying to achieve?
This is the cull of the nobility. Yes.
Yes, the cull of the nobility, but why so many? 9 out of 10, including children.
Yeah. Um, Hard to say. Quite often, any kind of imperial bureaucratic machine um, loses its sense of humanity fairly quickly, um, and so 9 out of 10 sounds great statistically, whatever, and so it's simply implemented, and whether it was ever achieved remains, is unknown. It seems unlikely that 9 out of 10 nobles were culled, but as propaganda, it's very powerful. And so again, how the state apparatus will operate is on the basis of propaganda and fear and misinformation. Um, and if you can make it sound, uh, inhumanly cruel, then it will have an effect in terms of controlling population, controlling your people.
Well, in this case, Dujang made sure that it didn't happen because he burned the archives, but still, it made me wonder why would Lassine go for something like that?
But again, I wouldn't lay it all at Lassine's feet. I think it's more a case of um, the entire power structure reaching levels of extreme levels, and you may think that that's unusual or atypical. It's not. Um, we can see how far even the bureaucratic power structure of uh, the U.S. immigration system actually takes children away from took children away from their parents and put them in cages. You know, could you imagine that actually happening in so-called democratic country? And yet it did. It did. So I don't find it stretching veracity in any sense. Those kind of systems of power and control, they have no constraints, none at all.
Um, for the next question, in discussing reinforcements for Dujak, Lorne informs him that he will receive a regiment of Wiccan Lancers. Given how things happened, the Wiccan Lancers never arrived, but I was wondering, was this Coltane's regiment? Did we just have foreshadow
Mm-hmm.
for Coltane?
Yeah.
Nice. This is probably obvious by this point, but Lorne and the Malazans don't seem to know much about Shadow and their gods. Nobody knows anything about them at this point. Yet Terrasail recognized the Hound and knew him by his name. She could recognize that this is Gear. So I was wondering if is this due to the fact that while the gods of Shadow are new, the Hounds are actually old entities
Oh
and
yeah,
they're
yeah.
known to the wizards.
Well, not known to wizards specifically, known to deck readers for sure, and that's what Tattersail is. But yeah, they were there long before Shadowthrone and Cotillion.
Uh, Terrasail tells Paran that through the antithesis of sorcery, which is Otataral, Adjunct Lorne may have linked herself to him. How does that work? How does...
No idea. No idea.
That's
And I
okay.
don't even know, I know it did a lot of weird things with the Tactile. Well, Tactile showed up in the games, and I remember, I think it's one of my inventions. But then Cam really took it and ran with it by creating the mines, and the Tactile mines. That's kind of sort of how the Malazan world sort of took shape, was that one of us would sort of create something, the other person would pick it up and run with it and elaborate on it. So the role of Otadero was initially for the game purposes of negating magic. And then that became, its function in the Malazan world, in the books as well. But there's more to Otadero, and that stuff we, I guess, invented for the games. And specifically in the creation of a Tactile. And I can't remember if the novels get specific on the creation of a Tactile, but it does relate to extreme amounts of magic. If the magic gets strong enough, it will actually devour itself and produce a Tactile. And so that's why you've got mines, because you've got huge areas that have been subjected to sorcery in the deep past. And those areas are permanently damaged, and that's what a Tactile is. It's the residue of that damage. So it will have, I guess, an area effect in terms of negation. But in terms of linking, I don't know, proximity, he hung out with her too much, I don't know, whatever. But I don't know how much we kind of pushed on that one. I think we probably pulled back a little bit. Yeah.
Now there's the issue of Lorne and Tool and his job in releasing Reyes. He tells Lorne that he was chosen for this task because he's unbound to Logros. And I was wondering what unbound means in this particular situation, because Onrak and the Seven Faces in the Rock, they are unbound because they were destroyed physically. And that also cut their link to the vow, not only to their tribe. While
Yeah.
in the case of Tool, his kin are dead, but he's not damaged. So how does
No.
that make him unbound? In the sense that he's unbound from the ritual as well, which would explain his more presence of mind, or is it just...
Yeah, he's in this case, unbound is probably too ephemeral a phrase. He's basically banished. He's been thrown out. He's been fired as the first sword. But of course, linguistically, the um, the language base for the Talana Mass, as I sort of came up with it, is pretty short. It's not extensive at all. So one word can have multiple meanings in the same fashion as in English, for that matter. So yeah, I just threw out unbound, and what happens, of course, is as you continue to write, you begin to elaborate and become more specific in what certain terms mean, and so it probably evolved through the series to mean something else. But when I look back on it now, I would think it's the equivalent of just being shunned or banished.
There's a dialogue that is really famous and loved by the fans, where uh, Lauren asked him what does he think about, and he says, "I think about futility." Then she asks, "Do all Tlanimas think about futility?" And says, "No." And again, she says, "Why?" And says, "That's because it's futile to think." So he seems a lot more present, a lot more emotional than most Tlanimas would be. And I was wondering if this being shunned is not just being cut from his own people, but also from the ritual itself, which allows him
Oh
to
yeah,
be a little more present.
yeah, absolutely. And of course, I can't. Um, I have to sort of pick and choose in terms of characters, doing character development for something like the Talana Mass. And I mean, the closest I ever got to sort of showing the Talana Mass en masse is in Memories of Ice and the Mibes and at Kovian, when at Kovian unleashes the memories to Talana Mass. I could then finally give them some of their stories. And I really enjoyed writing that section. I remember that, to this day. It was really nice to sort of unfold the lives of these undead creatures and make them, well, I guess humanize them in a sense.
It was a deeply emotional moment.
Well, and of course the timing, you hold off on that stuff until the timing is right. And I wanted to deliver as effective an emotional impact as possible. So it had to be tied in with the Kovian story, because he was going to be the focal point for the emotional impact between him and the Talana Mass. And of course, that stuff's sitting in front, and the Mibe story is waiting behind it, right? So
we know that Tattersail had been about to become master of the deck, and that her untimely death and her connection to Paran are what got him the job in the end.
mm-hmm.
But there are two questions I have regarding this. On one hand, Paran realizes that the way a mortal is being crafted into a tool by the gods is by removing everyone they care about, and then people start dropping dead around Paran, Tattersail included.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, it raises the issue of Opal's ability to foresee the consequences of their own meddling. When Paran chose to buy his sword and name it Chance, could they have foreseen that he would become master of the deck and that their influence
No,
might... No.
no, I don't think so. I think it's more um, he just caught their attention at that point, and they may explain it later that they planned it all, but no. The random element is embodied in the sword named Chance, and that's the thing. I mean, that random element, even Opon, even the two gods, twin gods, are subject to chance as well, and random elements. They might say otherwise, but they are.
There's always this question. It seems like Paran was meant to be master of the deck, so where does Tattersail fit in it? It's a bit blurry there.
Yeah, I don't know. I think um, I may have invented that on the fly. Um, I mean, I had great regret at losing Tattersail as a character, because I really liked her, but in a sense, the story sort of led me in that direction very early on, and then I realized, well, here I'm setting up, what looks to be, for the reader, you're one of the primary protagonists, and then I just, kill her a third of the way into the book. But it did set the precedent to warn the reader that nobody's safe. So I held on to it. So yeah, I just probably was inventing on the fly there.
This one might be a little specific, but it's just a minor curiosity. It's not even important in the grand scheme of things. Beludin tells Tattersail that Taishran anticipated that she would take the route over land to Dargistan because her feed warden doesn't work over water. Now, I know that Shadow works over water. I was wondering why would Fear have problems with it?
It had more to do with the belligerence of the god Male than anything else, because Male is a reluctant god in the sense that he does not appreciate what most of his worshippers are up to. And shadow, the shadow realm, of course, exists everywhere. The thing is, it's extremely random when you show up. So the risk is always that you step into that ward, and you may be on land here on the Malazan world, and you can step into the middle of an ocean over there. So it's the most unpredictable of all the warrens is shadow, because it is all um, it's once removed from its own reality. If you think of what shadow is, I mean, shadow on the ground, it requires a light source, and it requires an object with some kind of material geometry to it. But the shadow itself is simply a casting of an absence of light. So it doesn't really exist, and so it is the most ephemeral of all the warrens. And so the rules that apply to shadow don't apply necessarily to anywhere else, and vice versa. So if it's said that Tattersail wanted to avoid the sea, then she wanted to avoid the sea. So also she grew up on an island, so it makes sense that she'd want to avoid the sea.
This one might also play into the whole uncertainty of information. Beludin claims that the Felomen, the Toblakai, they have Jeghar blood, while Gothos denies it. If that was true, then it means that Icarium has a lot more Jaghut blood than we think. So would that be
Mm-hmm.
true or just speculation?
It's probably one of those things where I leave it open. I don't know how, whether it makes a huge difference or not. Um, the Jagu as characters took form quite slowly. Um, when Ries first appears, you sense that these are, um, you know, they are almost the equivalent of the Dark Lord kind of entities. Um, but as the series goes on, the Jaguts start really developing their own personalities and um, their own approaches to things. And I think it helped that Gothos Folly was cited very early on, because that gave me a counterpoint to someone like Reyes, the Tyrant. And if you have a counterpoint, if you're creating sort of a character traits or a species trait, culture's traits, as a writer, as a world builder, I think thinking about it now, it's extremely useful to create two extremes. And then once you have those two extremes put in place, in this case, Gothos, say, and Riest, um, then you got your framing points, and you can then have variations within that frame, between those two framing points, those two extremes, and um, and then by playing with that controlled sort of space in terms of their characterization, you start creating an identity for the entire culture. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think as a lesson, bless you, as a lesson for world building, uh, just thinking about it now, that might be quite, a decent lesson, is to create those two extremes, and then everything in between is what constitutes the character traits of a culture or a people, and that takes time, and it built over the series for sure.
Um, the big scene where Terrasil dies, the mechanics of it have always eluded me, and I think I finally got it right. So there she is, she realizes she has nowhere to go. If she doesn't access her warren, she is going back to Taishan and she can't afford that. If she does access it, she's dead. So she looks at Nightchill's bag and she realizes that that's her spell there. It's a spell of preservation of other things. So she probably imagines, even if I die, I can do what Quickband did for Hairlock with the puppet and use the same spell that I witnessed and now know and move myself into Nightchill's body, ravaged as it may be. I can still use it because it won't be destroyed by the magic because of the preservation spell. But that still seems like a
No, yeah,
bad idea.
it's entirely by chance. Um, there was no deliberate intention on her part to evade or avoid her own death. So it was entirely by chance that that spell, preservation spell, was there. The effect of the Talan worn surrounding Tool was lingering. Um, uh, those are entirely just by circumstance, in which case it then becomes a question of how much was Opon involved, and I couldn't answer, but possibly.
Well, she did
Or
answer.
possibly that residual chance element of those two, twin gestures being in play would have had a role to play. But I mean, it's set up in the sense that the preservation spell had to be there, and Nightshield's body had to be there for Tattersail's resurrection.
Also, right after the scene, Tool observes the pillar of fire and he tells Lorne that something has happened, and then he starts listing all of these warrens. That's the first time we get introduced to them. Most of them make sense. We have Talan from Tool, and then there's Denul, probably from Terrasail using the soul shifting spell. We have Dries and Tenes, which are earth and stone from the Toblakai, from Velurdan. And then he lists Thelomen Toblakai, which is a warren we've never seen after or before. And I was wondering, in House of Chains, we get to find out that some Toblakai get so powerful they become a warren on their own. Would that be the warren that they use, Thelomen Toblakai? Because we've never heard it before. Or after.
Yeah, that's probably an instance where I threw one phrase in too many. I could have just left out the Telomen Toblakai. But there is an innate, I can't go too far in this because, oh man, Cam's going to be annoyed. Belladonna is a character in Cam's latest novel, so I'm not going to go into too much detail.
Okay.
But I think probably what I was referencing there was simply Belladonna's own nature as a Telomen Toblakai.
And there is one more word he mentions that I cannot fit anyway, and that's Tarvel de Melaine.
Mm-hmm.
How do the dragons fit in here? Nightchill is not a dragon, neither one of them is, so how does it fit?
Startled Demerling. Let me think on that one. This is a long time ago. I think anything I came up with would be retconning in some fashion or another. So I'm just gonna, I won't be able to answer that one.
That's okay. At least we know that there's nothing to it, so people will stop asking.
No, I can't say there's nothing to it, but I just can't think of anything at the moment. Only in the sense of, no, you see that now I'm talking walk in shadow. I can't do that either. There is a relationship between obviously all the Warrens and dragons, which I think is alluded to in Fall of Light, I think. If not, it's going to be in Walk in Shadow. So I can't go into detail there. So maybe it's not retconning. It's just a case of of dropping something way too early in the series. That's not going to get a resolution until Walk in Shadow. It's possible. It's possible. I mean, we're talking, so long ago now that I really can't tell you what my mindset was in a lot of this stuff.
Makes sense. This is a question that I've seen popping up so many times. With the Tulani Mass, the apostrophe means that the individual is dead.
It's past tense.
Past
tense. Yeah.
Does the apostrophe mean the same thing for Kru's name?
Of course.
Really?
Mm.
Okay, I thought it was specific to the mass language, not to everybody. That means that Teishran also is going to be past tense.
Teishran?
Yeah, he becomes Turen.
Yes, when Cam does it, absolutely. Yeah. Now, it's not necessarily being dead. It's more a case of a personality coming to an end and a new one taking its place, if you will. A kind of a spiritual or emotional resurrection as well.
Okay, that's actually good info. Uh, the first empire. That's a really tricky thing, specifically the first empire of the MS.
Oh, okay.
On one side, Rest, he says that he set up an empire in which the Imas thrived. So I was wondering, would the first empire of the Imas be Rest's empire?
No.
On the other, Pranchol says that with the gathering, the clan Imas shall be born and the first empire. So the first empire is actually the first empire of the undead, so to say, Imas.
Yeah. The problem is that there's more than one first empire. It's all contextual. There's a very different one on Seven Cities, for example. And I think what happens is I'll end up using a phrase, and we may use it in our gaming or whatever in a campaign, and then that phrase sticks, and then it reappears somewhere else, and there may be no relation between the two, but it becomes part of the language, if you will, of the Malazan universe, that they will use this phrase. So I think what Pranchol is referring to is very much the Tilan Amas First Empire, um, an undead empire, or deathless empire, I guess would be the best way to put it.
Okay, because we knew that the human first empire of the Simbalakis had been preceded by a first empire of the MS, that one was always very mysterious.
Yeah, yeah, it is to me too.
But at least we know we suffer together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Uh, this one is maybe a little funny. Do warrens or magic aspects have colors of their own? During battles, we see waves of magic that come and they're colored. We have gray for shadow, and black for Kurel Galen, and silver for chaos, blinding white for Theodore Leo Sun. But these sort of come with the territory. When Crone heads for Brood's camp, she can spot his stand because of his Drist magic, which she sees as a cloud of magenta. So
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, is the magenta just her way of perceiving magic? Or would Brood swing his hammer and this magenta wave shoots out of him? That would kind of be
No
funny.
idea. I don't think we ever attributed a color to what Kaladin Brood was doing. Um, so that's probably more Crone than anything else. You know, in terms of their origins, they're a bit unique in the universe. So um, yeah, they're bridging two completely different worlds, universes even. Um, so yeah, again, I wouldn't sort of put too much weight on uh, that attribution.
So it's basically the way she senses magic, the way she
Yeah,
identifies it.
yeah.
Um, some of my questions are probably less of questions and more of this is awesome. So this will play along those lines. Uh, Crone says that she has a different master other than Rape. Then she steps into Brood's tent and calls him master. And for any first reader, that's a deception, like she's playing the two against each other, when she clearly means that her other master is the cripple god, which
Mm-hmm.
we get to see later on. And I was wondering, how much did you giggle when you introduced that to us?
I like the notion of the great ravens being the equivalent of maggots in the corpse of a god. Um, so in that respect, I remember reading somebody who just said they never read any further once they got to the talking raven. They just threw the book away at that point. I could see that. I could see that. I think I pushed it a fair bit with Chrome, but I think Chrome was in our gaming. I'm pretty sure she was in our gaming in Darujhistan. I could be wrong. I'll have to ask Cam if he remembers that or not. Um, so yeah, she's yeah, different masters. Yeah.
Oh, Crone is awesome. Why would anybody mind?
I
Well,
don't know.
matter of taste.
Mm.
Um, in the case of other gods, I understand why they would need mortal tools. But why would Opon need a mortal tool? There's a mention here that the coin spins in spheres that are otherwise immune to the jester's influence thanks to Crocus. What spheres could possibly be immune to luck?
I don't know. I don't know.
Speculative question. What if Rake was to use Dragnipur to kill Opon? How would you see the Malazan world without the avatar of luck? Because you can't kill the actual magic aspect, but
No,
you
you wouldn't
can
kill.
kill the god.
Yeah, you can kill a god, but it would transfer to somebody else. Somebody else would pick it up for sure, because those forces are present. I mean, the random elements, as far as we can tell, anyways, they seem random, are present in all universes. So
Um, One issue that is often brought up is the age of different characters. Rake is said to be 2,000 years old in Gardens of the Moon, yet the Tlanimas are 300,000 years old and he's been there before. So,
yeah, throw those ages out. Nobody really knows how old everybody is.
um, let's see the next one. Were the Kachin Chamel unwitting victims of the war between the Jagut, and the Tlanimas? Because when Pranchol arrives in the dreamland of Krup, he gives a sort of update of their time and he says how they hunted the herds to extinction. The Forkula Sale are no more, but they never had to seek them out. The Kachin Chamel are no more because the ice spoke to them with words of death. So I was wondering if the entropy spell that they released into Corel Galen was maybe their revenge against the extinction that this world brought to them.
Quite possibly. I can't go into much detail because of Cam's books that he's writing right now. So some of this stuff is going to be explored in detail.
Uh, Pranchol also knows that soon they will be performing the ritual and the sundering of flesh and time, which suggests he knew what the consequences of the ritual would be, unlike the Crimson Guard who had no idea what they were doing. So are we to understand that all the Mass knew the consequences of the vow, or is this something
Well,
that
you
only
you
he's
can
aware of?
yeah, you can know consequences without actually fully understanding them, right? Once you're actually experiencing something, it's a whole different beast than and just intellectually being aware of what it is you're doing. It's how most horrendous decisions are made. Um, one can be aware of those consequences, but actually experiencing them, it's a whole different beast. And so, yeah, I mean, he's being a bit facile, I think, in his descriptions, and his confidence, I think, is somewhat false.
Silverfox, we know that she's made of several entities, but how she's a child of Talan has always been a bit weird, especially since she's also a child of Pranchol. And I think that I finally understood how it worked. During the scene of her birth, while the Mahib is giving birth, Pranchol is in a lot of pain, which makes me think that she was probably drawing on his magic the way she was feeding on the Mahib after she was born. And that is how he became her actual parent. Is
Mm-hmm.
that right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a mystery resolved. Oh, there is a symbolism to the way Silverfox begins in the undead body of Nightchill and into life, so she can turn the undead Planimas back to life. I suppose the parallel was not accidental.
Mm-mm.
Okay. Um, this one is actually a little interesting. Cruel tells Krup that the child in the Mahib's womb had no soul to begin with, and that it was prepared in a manner known to no man, including Cruel himself, and that the magic belongs to the moon. Now, the soulless child is reminding of the Wiccans and their rebirth magic. But this scene seems to me a hint at Ardatha's magic and her moon and feminine magic. Was this the first foreshadow we get of Ardatha and the feminine specific brand of magic?
It may have been. I don't know how much it was later explored. Maybe Cam explored it more than I did. Um, I mean, that's one of the things is that, you know, so much of the gaming created this backstory. And so we both had, you know, almost the same encyclopedia to draw upon. And where we had any doubts, we would ask each other. So that's probably why things fit into place, because we were uh, conscious enough of the things we had already put in place. And so we were just sort of selecting and drawing from that same shared pool of knowledge.
Okay, two more questions and then I'm done. Um, this one is also another question I've seen often repeating. It attracts people's attention. Pranchol says that he's saddened he won't be here to see Terrasail grow up into the woman she would grow up, Silver Fox. And Krup tells him that you will be here, but not as a Tlan, but rather as a Tlanimas. But in both instances, they are spelled with an apostrophe. Now, some people say it's just a mistype because it means you won't be here as a living flesh and blood, but you will be as an undead. Others try to see a deeper meaning to that apostrophe. So I was wondering, what's your position on that?
I don't know. I'd have to take a look at the actual section. It sounds like, I mean, it could easily be a copy editing error. Um,
That's what
Somebody wanting to be consistent in the Talana Mass. Um, and sometimes, you know, I would have missed somebody making that correction quite easily, I think.
that's what I think it is because he means not as a living
Yeah,
mass, but rather as an undead mass. So it
exactly.
should be
Yeah.
one with apostrophe and one without.
One without, yeah. But of course, you know, the copy editor for the first book had no idea what I was up to. So I felt sorry for her. And yeah, I think we worked, yeah. There's a lot of that kind of stuff where I had to sort of go back and say, no, step this, step that. Yeah.
And for the last question, why did you choose gestures to represent luck?
Uh, because a lot of what was happening in Gardens of the Moon, based on the screenplay, was comedic. So in that sense, how could it not be? You know, a lot of the stuff's, you know, set up for laughs, and I think a lot of people forget that, or maybe they don't see it. But you know, the the dismantling of the fantasy tropes, um, yeah, you're meant to laugh because you're led to one expectation, and uh, based on fantasy as a genre, and then, you know, when you arrive there, I completely just sort of flip it on its end. Um, you know, a classic example would be Crocus not getting the girl, right? Because he's racing around doing all those other things at the fete. And when he finally gets there, no, somebody else saved her. And so that stuff comes from the script in the sense that we were setting up your cliched scenes of, you know, the hero Lucas saving Leia or whatever, and then just completely, you know, kicking them to the side of the road, and laughing. You know, that's the kind of stuff that entertained me in Cannes, was just setting up these things and then screwing around with them. Um, and also, I think Opon originally was very much a part of the deck of dragons, and so you need jokers in the deck of cards. And so I think that's probably the more prosaic reasoning behind it all. But once it was there, then it became, you know, well suited to writing Gardens of the Moon with a slightly sly sort of regard, in terms of what was being set up and all those chance events that occurred. Um, kind of a wink to the audience, and maybe that was kind of a mistake at the same time. So, well, you know, we know how problematic this novel is.
But I loved it. If you allow me just one more, I made a promise and I got involved with my list, and I promised I would ask this question.
Mm-hmm.
If you could describe how Moonspawn actually looks like. We know it's one of the Changeable fortresses, but do we have houses? Do we have windows? Do we have balconies? How does it actually look like? We have towers.
No, I know. I've seen so many different versions of Moonspawn. No, it's a roughly oblong, but vertical, not sideways. Um, Misshapen chunk of basalt, and it's got one small ledge, and that ledge has a door in a recess, and that's your only entrance into the city inside Moonspawn. So on the outside, it looks like a perfectly, if you know, if you were to put it in orbit, nobody would think twice about it. It looked like an asteroid. It's just there's nothing, there's nothing constructed on the outside of Moonspawn at all.
Cool.
No city sitting on top, none of that. And you know, somewhere in my archives, I've got the diagram of Moonspawn, and yeah, it's there's the entire construct, which is kind of a fortress, is internal, and it's floating actually mostly in the center, and you have to reach it by a bridge, a footbridge or a span bridge, stone bridge that goes across to it. Maybe I can track that down and I'll post it somewhere.
That would be interesting. All right, so thank you for your time, for your patience.
No problem, no problem. So have you got like 1,000 more questions for the rest of the series?
Probably.
Well, yeah, I guess that's to be expected. There's a lot in there. Okay, take care. Have a good holidays.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye bye.